the throttle, victory is mine. Show you the harder the battle, harder I fight. I've come too far to quit. Step back, I'm going in. I'm cranking up on the throttle. This is how legends are made. This is how legends are made. This is how legends are made.
Ladies and gentlemen, hello and welcome, good evening to another World of Warships live stream. I'm Mr. Conway and it's my pleasure to present to you another episode of our Armchair Admirals talk show, podcast, whatever term floats your boat. I'm of course not alone. Joining me today are a number of voted military history experts. First, but definitely not foremost among this company. I'm sorry, Tuccy. Is Tuccy? Hello, Tuccy.
Hello. Yeah, well, that makes sense, right? Like a warm-up thing. Hello, people, and welcome to the next installment. Today we will be talking about the battles of Narvik and about generally the Norwegian unpleasantness of 1940, because it's April and it happened in April. And to help us with that, we have our two guests, who shall be in the order of random choice.
Drachinifel! Yay!
Hello, it is I am Drachinifel. I am the sole survivor of every Armchair Admirals broadcast so far, so I'm currently technically winning.
Yes.
Yes.
That's true. And of course, Dr. Alexander Clarke. Hello.
Oh, I am the newbie and enjoying every single one, and especially today's because
We will be talking about...
private class destroyers.
Yes.
Excellent. Okay, so we'll go back here. So there's all four of us. So yes, today we're going to be talking about the battles of Narvik, where the Germans naughtily decided Norway is nice. They've got iron. We want it. We will take it.
Technically, Norway doesn't have iron, but it has ice-free ports.
For Swedish
Sweden has iron, but Sweden has ice.
Okay.
It's complicated.
From a technical perspective, they apparently only have ports that they wanted. But anyway, they wanted it, and they're going to go there. So let me quickly talk you through, if you're new here, if it's your first Armchair Admirals experience, of how this is going to work. First of all, we are going to be talking at you a little bit, right? We have some really very knowledgeable people here who will tell you about the battles of Narvik, because there was more than one. Apparently, there were even three, although I don't think we're talking about the third one today. And then afterwards, we are going to have a look at some questions that you guys submitted. We always announce these a few days earlier and give you a chance to send some questions in, so our experts can, do a bit of research and give you a high quality answer. And then finally, we're going to just have some chit chat with you in chat. But in general, if you have a question for our experts that is relevant to what we're talking about right now, right? So if we're talking about something, point A, and you're asking about point C, I'm not going to take that question. But if you have questions for like the topic that we're currently on, then please always ask them. Otherwise, we can take random questions at the end of the day. Yes, Mr. Conway's hair, welcome back. It's fantastic to see you. Yes, hairdressers are still closed in the Czech Republic. We are live today.
Just a sec, Bilgit Widget from YouTube is reporting echo sound, so I'm asking
Echo
him
sound.
to tell who is getting echo, if we all are, or... But, yeah.
I don't know. Maybe
I'm
you've got
not.
it open twice. I don't think that we have any. I'm just gonna put my nobody. We don't have echo. Close your second tab. Maybe it's related to the fact that we are today live on YouTube, Facebook, Twitch, and Steam.
Yes.
So we're going to try and watch all the chat channels. If you have questions, go ahead and ask them. And a big shout out to the people joining us on Facebook, where we usually don't broadcast Armchair Admirals. So please let us know over there if you enjoy this and if you want us to include you in future broadcasts. Okay, enough talking from my side. Who wants to start?
Right. Well,
I think we've assigned our roles,
Yes.
roles at the beginning. So I'll do a quick rundown through the Norwegian campaign, like how did it start? When did it start?
Do you want me to bring up the graphical the images that we have?
Not yet. That will be for
Not
the
yet.
battles. But I will replace Dr. Clark with a high-tech map.
Okay, we can. I wish you would have told me this before. Okay. Do I have a look? This is okay. Sorry, Dr. Clark. This is just going to be.
Yeah?
We're just going to literally replace you.
Yes.
I'll play that.
It will be just for a second because just to illustrate what was this all about. This is Norway and Sweden. Now Sweden around here has iron ore and other metals, but iron was the most important, especially for Germans. But Sweden has a little problem called ice, because Baltic Sea in the winter freezes over, nothing moves, especially up here. On the other hand, Norway here has a little port of Narvik, which is fairly close to Sweden. There are mountains, but the railway was built and the Narvik is in the Gulf Stream, so it doesn't freeze over, mostly. To get the iron to Germany at all times, the easiest way was by train to Narvik and then by ship skirting Norway through the Norwegian coastal waters all the way down to Germany, which meant that the British were legally unable to really intercept the shipments because, neutrality and rules and stuff. And they didn't like it. On the other hand, for Germany, it was also kind of wobbly because it basically relied on the Norwegian neutrality, or at least neutrality and goodwill and stuff. So both sides at one point or another started thinking about how to change this status. For the Allies, the plan was to basically mine the coastal waters, to push the German ships out into the open sea where they can catch them. That's okay, it's some violation of neutrality, but that was the first step. Second step, especially in case Germany wanted to do something about it, would be to actually physically occupy the port of Narvik. And for this, there was a quite strong mine-laying force put together, and battleship covering force, battle cruisers, aircraft carriers, everything, to set sail in April 1940, in early April. At the same time, Germany started planning already a bit before that, and they obviously wanted to secure the iron supply. Their plan was a bit more straightforward, simply smash and grab, take Denmark, take Norway, and have it all secured. To take Norway, they needed to take basically all important ports and the capital. The Oslo, Kristiansand, Bergen, Stavanger, Trondheim, and up here Narvik. The Narvik was the main prize, but obviously all the other ports needed to be taken for it to work, and they needed to be all hit at the same time. That was quite important for the plan, and that meant that it was a hugely complicated plan that basically demanded the entire force that the Kriegsmarine had, and there were some issues. Issue number one was obviously on approach to Oslo, down here, because while the Norwegian mobilization effort left a lot to be desired, because the notification about mobilization and about impeding war was sent by telegraphs and by snail mail even, instead of using radio and stuff. Still, the commander of the Oscarsborg fortress at the entrance to the Oslo Fjord already had a feeling that something's happening, because there were incidents already before with patrol boats and stuff. So when he saw a huge unmarked ships creeping in, he ordered his guns to open fire, which wasn't really that easy because he didn't have even enough crews for them. So he was able to fire 2 shells, I think, or 3, before Blücher, the first ship, moved out of his firing arc, right into the firing arc of a coast-mounting torpedo battery that sunk the cruiser. That was problem number one, because that meant that the government in Oslo got enough time to evacuate. Big problem number 2 was that somewhere around here, the British covering force for the mine-laying operation had some encounters with the German force that went to Trondheim and to Narvik, which obviously spoiled the plan a bit. It ended up with the HMS Glowworm being sunk by Admiral Hipper, but not before she managed to make quite a big hole into the Hipper while ramming her. And that meant that Hipper was kind of damaged. Another issue was somewhere around here in one of the fjords where a tiny little Norwegian patrol boat that could, the Nordkapp, managed to catch a lurking German oiler full of oil for destroyers that were heading to Narvik. And I think that's where we actually are getting slowly to the first battle.
Yeah.
So, who took...
Welcome back.
Yes, welcome back. And who took the first battle?
That's me.
Drach, isn't it? Yeah.
Yes.
So now Mr. Conway can put on the slideshow already. With
I
the
can
images.
put on the slideshow, which isn't a slideshow because a slideshow is a slideshow.
Yeah.
Here we go.
Right.
The first image needs some explanation because I have no idea what it is.
Right. Well, the first image will hopefully come up for me in a second because
Oh,
lag.
that belongs rather to latter part, but it's a burning ship.
It's a burning ship. I wish I was assuming you had pre-ordered these for convenience sake. Let's continue. Okay. Battles of Narvik. Go ahead.
Yes. So what's happened with the first Battle of Narvik is this develops pretty much the day after you get Eidsvold and Norge, the two Norwegian coastal defense ships, are sunk by the German destroyers coming in, and the Germans have planned all of this relatively well in advance. They know the destroyers can only have enough fuel to get there. They don't have enough fuel really for operations or to get back. So they've sent in first the Jan Velem, I believe it's pronounced.
Yes.
Which is a converted ship that's been converted to an oil tanker. So it's already there basically under false pretenses and it's full of oil. The second ship, however, Kattegat, is the one that Nordkapp sinks. And it's not just the amount of fuel that goes down, it's the fact that there is only one tanker now. So the German destroyers, they can fuel 2 at a time off of the tankers, but with only one tanker, that means only 2 ships can refuel. They've got 10 destroyers there. It's going to take a little while, as opposed to if they could do it 4 at a time. So within 24 hours, we get Commander Warburton Lee with his flotilla of destroyers, all because the Royal Navy likes building destroyers and naming them all with names with the same letter. They're H class, so you've got Hardy, Hotspur, Havoc, Hunter, and Hostile. And he decides to move in ASAP. He does a little bit of browbeating of his senior officers as well, just to get them in at this point, because there is some idea of perhaps waiting for some more firepower. There's a British cruiser, a few more British destroyers in the area, but he decides he's going to go in ASAP. And as he moves in, some of the German destroyers are still in Narvik port itself refueling. Others are just generically in Narvik port waiting for various things to happen. A few of them under, at the time, I believe it's some rank of Captain Bay, who will later show up at the Battle of North Cape in charge of Scharnhorst, are off elsewhere. The British destroyers managed to enter Narvik. They arrive basically by complete surprise. They lay into anything that they can find, whether that be captured merchant ships, German destroyers, etc., using guns and torpedoes. The Germans say that because they're caught by surprise, they can't respond immediately. The commander of the German force gets his ship blown in half underneath him by a torpedo. And when they rally and start returning fire on the British ships, they discover that for a variety of reasons, their German torpedoes are running deep. So none of the German torpedoes fired at this point in the engagement actually do anything other than produce some interesting bubble tracks under a few British destroyers. So his task having been accomplished, the destroyers under Warburton Lee pull out of the actual harbour of Narvik. And it's at this point, whilst they're thinking, do we go in again? Is there anything else we can do? This is when the other destroyers come up from further down the fjord, and then they're also joined by 2 other destroyers that were hiding closer towards the seaward end of the fjord. And you get this running fight. It's now equal numbers of destroyers, except the H-class are not the world's largest destroyers, and the German destroyers are quite substantial. So in this running fight, the British then lose 2 ships, Hunter and Hardy, and another one is badly damaged. Warburton Lee goes down with his ship, and that's where we got that picture of that burning destroyer, which was Hardy. So you have this huge melee engagement going on. The Germans take a little bit of damage in exchange, but it is the first Battle of Narvik is kind of it's a battle of 2 halves. The first half in Narvik Harbour itself is decisive British victory. The second half, the British lose 2 destroyers and 1 badly damaged in exchange for 1 or 2 German destroyers mildly damaged. So the Germans win that second half. What's left of Warburton Lee's destroyers then withdraw out of the fjord, and on their way out, they come across another German supply ship, which is trying to make its way in, and that doesn't go particularly well for the poor old supply ship. It's full of ammunition, so it's called Raunfels, I believe, and it's not going to try fighting destroyers when it's packed full of explosives. So it tries to run itself aground. It gets set on fire. It later goes boom. So the Germans, now having planned to have 3 supply ships present, are down 2 of those supply ships, which means they've got half the fuel they wanted to have, and they also are now going to be running somewhat short of ammunition and spare parts, which were aboard the Raunfels and are now scattered widely over the Norwegian landscape. So that wraps up the first Battle of Narvik. In terms of vessels sunk, it's kind of an even honours game, but as the Kriegsmarine is rapidly finding out, the British have a lot of ships. They really don't. The fact there's a few incidents later on that damage a couple more German destroyers independently of the battle doesn't help. But the Germans are now faced with, they're low on torpedoes, they're low on main gun ammunition, and some of their ships are damaged from combat. Some of their ships are damaged from going aground. They actually have relatively few combat-capable ships left by the end of this engagement. And thus ends the first Battle of Narvik.
There were a few comments already in the chats, both on the YouTube and from Eric Aukan on the Facebook, about the depth setting of the German destroyer torpedoes. Why do you think were they set to run too deep? Was it because they were preparing to engage capital ships, or was it still a relic from the attack on the coastal defense ships?
It's a mixture of things. The depth setting on the actual depth setting on the German torpedoes is not terribly bad. It's slightly deeper than what you might call the World War II average, but they should have hit the British destroyers. The combination of things appears to be, one, that Warburton Lee's destroyers are riding fairly high. They themselves are low on fuel as well, so they're drawing a few feet less than they would normally, plus the fact that you're in a fjord, which means although you're not in purely fresh water, the salinity levels in that far up the fjord are not as high as they are out at sea, which means obviously salt water is slightly denser, therefore buoyancy of the ships is slightly greater. And so if you are launching torpedoes set to a certain depth, which is obviously controlled by pressure, in partially fresh water, they are going to run slightly deeper anyway. So because of the environmental conditions, the torpedoes are running deeper than they think they are, and the British destroyers are running slightly shallower than they normally would be, and that gives them just enough wiggle room for the torpedoes to pass through. If it had been one or the other, I don't think you would have been seeing that the kind of run under the keel that you get in some situations, but it is what it is.
Well, thanks. So basically, after the first battle, we have ended with a depleted destroyer force in the fjord, bottled up. What was stopping them from leaving apart from the fuel?
It's mostly the fuel, basically. They had a few destroyers that were now fueled up, although they'd burned off a bunch of fuel during the engagement, so they would have to refuel. and they knew that there were British ships waiting for them outside in the open sea, and maybe all 10 destroyers working together might have been able to force their way past the sort of the inner guard of British ships and run south. But with the ships they had left that were operational, they knew they weren't going to be able to do that. So it was a case of try and hope that they can repair some of the destroyers that are damaged, try and hope that they can get some restock, maybe some Luftwaffe air support, basically anything other than the situation they were in at this point.
And they really didn't want to take on those destroyers standing at the entrance. Those destroyers, it was 4 tribal class destroyers. Well, 3, 1 joins in a bit, 4th joins quite quickly afterwards, and HMS Arefuser. Now, this force was part of the British pre-positioning anyway, because remember, they were hunting German destroyer reports. They weren't quite sure which fjord they were in. Believe it or not, Warburton Lee's was not the only little flotilla sent hunting. One of the things that often people go is, why weren't the tribals and the Arefuser class cruiser with them? Well, if they had been with them, it would have been a very interesting battle for the Germans. They would have probably been taken care of in one battle for starters. But more importantly, if the British had sent them in there, then if the Germans had turned out to be in a different fjord, they'd have been a long way away from being able to support that flotilla in another fjord. So that's what the British have been hedging on. This is the trouble: is you have a lot of more ships, but you also have a lot more places to cover, because the Germans are going to be in one place, but you don't know exactly where that place is. You'll have to search them all. And the second battle is going to be fun.
Mm-hmm. I was just going to say, just bearing in mind that also we're talking within 24 to 48 hours of the invasion of Norway kicking off. The British don't know exactly where all the German ships are. They know that there's multiple landings in multiple different German ports, but Glowworm versus Hipper has just happened, and as far as the British are concerned, there may be more German formations out there. The 2 Scharnhorsts are floating around, not actively landing troops. And so, although the Germans have committed a significant portion of Kriegsmarine combat strength, they haven't committed all of it. But the British don't know that.
When did actually the Scharnhorsts run into the battle cruiser?
Into Renown.
Into Renown, yeah.
It's all happening around about the same time.
Because weren't the Warburton Lee's destroyers initially part of the Renown screen?
No, one of the H's was, but it wasn't actually one of the ones attached to him. The trouble is, everyone traditionally, all the names we group together in the same flotilla. However, and this is going to sound strange, the Royal Navy is already experiencing the joy that, oh frick, that needs maintenance, so we're going to have to attach that one, which is actually why his flotilla, one of the H destroyers which goes in his flotilla wasn't actually even supposed to be with them. They just turned up and went, well, we're here, so we're going with you. I'm forgetting which of the ones it was. Was it Havoc? I think it was Havoc, which randomly turned up and went, oh, if you're going in, we're here, we're going with you as extra.
So
this is what you have with the Royal Navy going on at this time.
The confrontation between Scharnhorst, Gneisenau, and Renown happens the day before First Battle of Narvik. Yeah, but the escort force for Renown is this follow-on, mostly the follow-on flotilla, I-class, with a few others randomly stuck in, but most of them are configured for mine laying, because that was the mine laying force that was supposed to be a part of the British move on Norway that got forestalled by the fact that Germans got there first.
Terrible. The Germans have waited 24 hours. We'd have seized those ports. It's the Germans again mucking up the great British timing. Right? It cares into what? It's just rude. They're jumping. They're playing the queue. We could accept all the rest, but queue jumping? Seriously.
Queue jumping is super rude. We had a little bit of a follow-up question earlier, by the way. There was a question on Twitch, actually. John L. 1967 was asking if Eisvold and is it Norge could have done anything different.
Not in the circumstances they were in, really. There's a There's a small amount they could have done if the Norwegian captains were a bit more aggressive, in that they could have opened fire first. But the whole thing with Norge and Eidsvold, their main advantage is in their heavier guns. Their heavier guns, they need range to operate them at. And unfortunately, when the German destroyers show up, they show up in almost literal whiteout conditions, to the point that Eidsvold, they spot the German destroyers at about 500 or 600 yards, and then they have this whole negotiation part. And then once the negotiations have broken down, there's maybe about 2 or 3 minutes in which Eidsvold could have opened fire on the Germans first. It doesn't, for various reasons. According to some, they're just about to open fire when they get torpedoed. But without that range granted to them by visibility, which the snow and sleet has removed, at point blank range in a gunfight with the destroyers, and the fact they're 1900 zero coastal defense ships, they have no torpedo defense, they just explode. And to give you some idea how bad the visibility is, Norge is sitting at the entrance to Narvik harbour, and as we saw from the previous map, it's not exactly the world's widest entrance, but the weather is so bad that when the wind randomly clears a little bit of it, the first thing that Norge knows about anything, apart from the fact it's heard this random explosion off in the distance, which turns out to be the death of Eidsvold, is they look around and there's already German destroyers in the Narvik harbour offloading troops. Oh. They've gone past each other without even seeing each other at that close range, and then there's a bit of a gunfight, but before long, Norge gets torpedoed as well, and that's the end of that. So, given the situation, there maybe could have damaged maybe a couple of German destroyers, and that probably would have mostly been Eidsvold doing that. But that's really about all you can ask them to do in the circumstances. If the weather had been clearer, it would be a completely different story. Probably still would have lost, but could have done a lot more damage. But the weather said no.
Yeah, Eric on Facebook actually comments. You were breaking up a bit.
Sorry. Dr. Clarke, you need to move a little bit closer to the microphone, I think.
Sorry.
I will just quickly jump because Eric Okan from Facebook also comments that basically the problem that Norge and Eidsvold would anyway have is that basically their fire control arrangements were even under good conditions, they were basically pre-World War I ships that didn't have any of the more modern implements that would help the crews even get the fire control data from the bridge. So
I mean, in the close range environment of the fjord, some of those are obviated a little bit. It is a bit of a shooting gallery because you can't go anywhere and everywhere. But it's, to be honest, even if they had the most modern fire control available in 1940, it's not going to grant them victory. They have no torpedo protection. The German destroyers have lots of torpedoes. And whilst they have heavier guns, there's a lot more guns on the German destroyers, and the Eidsvolds, and particularly pretty much all of their gun mounts, with the exception of the two main guns, are not exactly heavily protected. So even if you disallow torpedoes completely and you just have a straight up gun engagement with both sides having equal fire control, the Norwegian ships would be overwhelmed by just mass gunfire relatively quickly. It's just the artifact of what happens when you have a couple of effectively unupgraded pre-dreadnought era coastal defense ships up against some of the largest and most heavily armed destroyers of the 1930s.
Yep. So, to answer your question, they were doomed. No matter what they did, there was no way they were getting out of there. Okay.
And that gets us to the second battle.
Second battle. Do we have an image prepared for the second battle?
Yes, they are there. You need to...
We have some more beautiful images.
Yeah.
I like what our team did there. Battle of April 10th. This is the first one.
This is the first
one. The Germans with their I guess technical victory kind of.
The first one, and then there will be... Oh yeah, here we are already in the second one, but the map for some reason is at the end. Here.
There we go. We've zoomed out a little bit. Map's been rotated, gentlemen. Okay, who wants to take this?
That's me.
Yes. Go ahead.
This is my fault. First things first. The first thing I have to say is, after the battle of the first battle of Narvik, you got the two forces basically taking stock. For the British, they've lost a very good flotilla commander. Warburton Lee was one of the better flotilla commanders, but he's one of many. Frederico Bronte, the German destroyer commander at Narvik, was not just a flotilla leader. He was actually the senior officer for destroyers in the German Navy. He was the top destroyer officer they had. So in a navy which had a dearth of experience in officers, in ship command at all, he was pretty darn critical. That's half the trouble they get into with preparing for the second battle, because it takes them a while to figure out who's in charge. Because he was so senior that, frankly, he didn't need a second in command or anything like that. And whilst there were lots of officers who thought they were his second in command, they eventually managed to work it out, but it does take them about 4 hours. With lots of officers going, hang on, you might have more seniority in rank, but I have more sea time. Which is always an interesting debate for naval officers to have. You might be senior to me, but you've spent 20 of the last 40 years sitting ashore, whereas I spent them at sea. So in the nicest way, your 2 months of seniority in rank do not matter. You don't know one end of a rope from another. So the Germans have that going on. And the British, well, the British have some pissed off tribal destroyers to deal with. Because that force, built around a refuser, containing Cossack, Bedouin, Eskimo, and Punjabi, had expected to go in. And were expecting to be sent in immediately. And they weren't. They're being held up because Whitworth, the admiral in charge, had heard this was a significant force of the Germans. And he knew how important their destroyers were to them. He also thought they might bring some submarines up to try and do some ambushes. And actually they would, but those poor submarines would have all their torpedoes fail to go off. Mainly because not just depth settings, but they had some fuse issues in that due to their efforts to keep their torpedo program secret, they hadn't done the exhaustive testing the Germans are really known for, and they didn't realize that their magnetic fuses had a sort of issue when they were in the higher latitudes with the various background magnetism going on of the Earth's gravity.
They were using magnetic fuses?
Yes.
Yeah.
It was a
Just to go up underneath the ship and blow it from underneath, because there was the idea to get round any torpedo defenses. Because if you have a magnetic fuse which goes off when it's underneath a ship, most ships don't have torpedo defenses down underneath, and you'll break the back of a ship. So even if you get one hit on a cattle ship, you'll cause a huge amount of damage.
Yeah, I mean the German submarine torpedoes before World War II got quite a few very advanced ideas going into them. They introduced the electric torpedoes for extra sneak attack, because that left completely no wake at all. That's obviously
the torpedo destroyers were all internal combustion engines, which were just weird.
Yeah. Then they came up with the magnetic detonator, and they came up also with a new mechanical detonator that was supposed to work very well. That was kind of the same case as the US Navy, right? That was also supposed to be advanced design.
The main difference between the Kriegsmarine and the US Navy when it came to war and their torpedoes was that when the U-boat captains came back from the Norwegian campaign, frothing at the mouth and demanding to know where the nearest torpedo designer was and could they please shoot him out the torpedo tube, Dönitz and Raeder, I don't know how that's pronounced, actually listened to them and said there is a problem with our torpedoes, and then basically they kind of did a version of, hello, Herr Torpedo Designer, either you fix this or the very angry U-boat captains I have in the next room get let into the room, and then I leave the room, and then I come back half an hour later, and honestly, nothing will have happened.
There is one poor commander who fires 4 times at HMS Warspite.
And none of them
4 times!
Yeah. Then, whereas with the Bureau of Ordnance, they just refused to believe that anything could possibly be wrong with the Holy Grail that is the Mark 14 torpedo.
Quick.
Even though, I mean, to be fair, it took about the same time to actually, like, from the entrance to the war to fix it. But in the German case, it was also because in the winter they couldn't test the torpedoes because the torpedo design and testing facility was in the Baltic. So
well, I mean, there's also the fact that the German contact detonators actually worked. So if the magnetic fuses didn't work, they could just go, okay, well, we'll go back to normal contact detonation, and that will work most of the time, as opposed to the Mark 6 exploder, which we're getting a bit sidetracked with that. But the Mark 14 and the Mark 6 exploder had a laundry list of issues, whereas with the German torpedoes, there were slightly fewer issues to fix, and there were backup solutions that they could use that would mostly work whilst they worked on the real
basically
problem.
If you set it on its basic setting with the most basic of its detonator systems, the Germans' torpedo still worked.
Yeah, even though I believe that
torpedo designer to the Mark 14 torpedo and used him to set it off manually when he got in contact with a ship, then it might have worked. Otherwise, that torpedo wasn't going to do anything.
Even though I believe that the Germany actually, even for the contact detonator, they got rid of the the detonator that was used at the beginning of war and replaced it with a simpler solution starting at 1942 because of it's nice, but it doesn't work.
So let's move away from torpedoes. They didn't work. We know we're getting sidetracked. Quick aside, actually, because somebody was asking, what's the scale? What's about the size of the fjord if we're looking at the map, and then we should get back to the battle.
We're talking miles. Let me just look up.
If you have like a rough idea for the people watching, because I believe it's rather a large fjord.
I have got a map with a scale on it.
But you keep narrating, and Tuccy will find the scale.
Okay.
Yes. I'll just quickly move this down. Yeah.
What they decided to add on to it, because Admiral Whitworth, first off, he decided to go himself. He felt rather guilty because of it had been his decision, which had sent Warburton Lee and his force into Narvik. He had had an inkling it was Narvik, but he hadn't been sure, so he'd sent out lots of feeler forces. He felt guilty because, and honestly, this feeler force had had so much trouble. Although his specific orders had been not to engage too heavily, to basically attack and dash if you felt you were facing superior forces. But this meant he decides to go in himself, and that means he's taking in his flagship, HMS Warspite. Yes. Who else to take into a fjord when you're basically going to be trapping the enemy? It's kind of like the idea of trapping a heavyweight boxer in a small portaloo with a load of, let's say, 7-year-old children that the boxer's really, really annoyed with. There is nothing going to be out of his range with him going in there. And that was Warspite.
Just quickly measure the fjord. It's the narrowest part is 44 miles deep. That's 80 kilometers. The complete fjord
big.
It's 132 kilometers, 70 miles. So a long, thin stretch of water.
It's well inside Norway, so we're technically having a land battle, you could argue. And he decides to add on to those 4 tribal class vessels 2 an H-class destroyer, HMS Hero, the sister of the ones which were in the first battle. An I-class destroyer, HMS Icarus. A K-class, Kimberley. And 2 F-class vessels, Forester and Foxhound. So he has 5 good standard destroyers and 4 tribal destroyers. So he has 5 ships which have a torpedo-heavy armament, and 4 ships which have a gun-heavy armament, and then he has Warspite. He decides not to take in a cruiser as well, because he decides if he has a cruiser and Warspite in that confined space, one of them will bash into the other, and the odds are that whatever the cruiser is, it won't come off that well. And actually, our refuser's job becomes, if anything tries to get past us, you can sink it. So HMS Our Refuser turned into the doorman from, well, most German destroyer captains' nightmares. Now, the advantages they have this time is that the weather is clearer. HMS Warspite will launch her Swordfish float plane, which is technically there to scout and spot for her guns, but, well, it's also going to get itself involved in a few bomb attacks when it gets the chance, because, why not? And, well, they're going to proceed up in 3 columns. Now, when they're first going in, they do actually get attacked by submarines, but none of them realize this, and, as I said, none of the torpedoes work. So all you have are a load of frustrated U-boat commanders and the Royal Navy sailing on going, we're invulnerable, but without realizing they're invulnerable. Now, this battle would quickly develop into fast-flowing skirmishes, but the Germans tried off, first of all, to try and ambush the British. This was actually quite silly if you think about it in hindsight, because once you realize the British are turning up with aerial reconnaissance, dividing your force, even though you are sending off your more damaged destroyers for it, is just going to make you weaker. But if you presume the British don't have aerial reconnaissance, I suppose it makes sense. Now, one German destroyer, the Erich Kuller, had been so badly damaged during the first battle that she was judged fit for ambush only, and she's supposed to go to Tastad. Unfortunately, she sights the British forces making their way in, and so her and her escorts lit up. The Hermann Kuhn goes back to try and warn everyone else that the British are coming, and they don't look like they're there for a friendly party. And the Kölner retreats into, and this is where my English version of Norwegian is going to sound terrible, but I do apologize now, retreats into Dupvik Bay. Now, if we're looking at the map, you can sort of see that is the little spot where you see Z13 pointing to. Okay? Just along from Oftfjord. So on there at the far end. Unfortunately, as said, the British have aerial reconnaissance. So she spotted the Swordfish crew, report this to the destroyers and Warspite.
They destroy?
And, well, let's put it this way. As they round the entrance, there are 24 4.7-inch guns firing each one firing a shell every 5 seconds. And then there's a salvo of torpedoes, and then there's a salvo of 15-inch shells from Warspite. So
that sounds like overkill to me.
Disappears in a massive explosion. I can't think why after this heavy application of high explosive she does this. But she literally rolls over and sinks after that. Hermann Kuhn has now, by this point, raised the alarm and forms up with Hans Ludemann, Wolfgang Zenker, and Bernard von Arnim to try and make a run at the British together. That's nice and brave, but again, this is 9 destroyers and Warspite coming to kill you. You're only 4 of you. You're brave, but that was probably not the best thing to do. The Germans are trying to focus, and you have to remember the German design has been on heavier, slower firing guns on their destroyers. The tribals, of course, are the epitome of the British perspective, which is slightly smaller, a lot faster firing guns. And so they're just having a blizzard of shells coming their way. The secondaries on Warspite are joining in. The primaries on Warspite join in occasionally. It turns into a running fight where the Germans keep trying to throw themselves at this wall of shells, this wall of metal and hot lead coming at them, and trying to break through, and they just aren't. Now, Punjabi is actually the one which gets focused on a lot in this fight. She draws a lot of the German fire. I'm not sure why they particularly like aim from Punjabi. And she actually has to fall out for a bit. retires and repairs herself, and then comes back an hour later to carry on fighting. This is how long this fight is going on. It's a bloody messy affair. But the problem is for the Germans is whatever angle they come at, they're finding that these these tribals have firepower all the way around. They don't have a weak side, and with tribals on either side, Warspite doesn't have a weak side. So their only option is to try and attack head-on, and then you're going head-on against every single shell you can possibly imagine. And I have utmost respect for the German crews. They're doing this very bravely. They've lost their most experienced officer already, who would have been the one directing them, and they're doing the best they can, but they have no real chance in this fight, especially with the submarines not being able to do anything. So at this point, the Hermann Kuhn decides to split from her other 3 colleagues and retreats up Herringer's Ford. Unfortunately, she's followed by Eskimo, who basically goes, "You're not getting away from me," which isn't very nice, who manages to torpedo her. The British torpedoes are working quite well. And so the Hermann Q is then forced to beach and basically is
that the
not in a very good
Z-19?
condition. That is, yes, Z-19. Sorry, I have to admit, I'm slightly annoying to some of my German Navy history colleagues because they talk about their numbers. I like to talk about the names of destroyers when they have names because I feel right.
I know. I was just translating to the map because our
Yeah.
map obviously has only the Z Z numbers on it.
I'll put that down. Sorry, I'll remember that and put that in. Anyway, at this point, the British destroyers divide into 2 groups. Warspite positions herself slightly above Narvik. She actually was ordered specifically by the British Admiralty not to go that far in the fjord. But we know from pictures taken that she actually gets almost as far... Well, on this map, they've got her getting to a position... You can see it's labelled very nicely. But actually, I have got a good authority of pictures taken in time. She doesn't get far from where you've got the Eskimo explosion sign. She gets very, very close. She does have to withdraw stern first at one point because she can't turn where she is.
You know, I've been to a Norwegian fjord, and I'm guessing the warships can't do that. But the captain went in the fjord and then just like, you know what? I'll show you how I can drive, and just spun this 300-meter long cruise ship in place in the middle of the fjord. There's like 100 meters of clearance on either side.
It has,
turning circle, turning radius.
They have bow thrusters and all sorts of things. Warspite, unfortunately, didn't have any of those.
Yeah.
At this point, you've got the 2 destroyers. You've got Cossack going into Narvik. And how do I put this? Cossack discovered Narvik was still held by the Dieter von Roda and Shore Battery. And so what she does, because there are these various, how do I put this, wrecks in her way, she can't get in the harbour. So she smashes onto a wreck, positions herself on top of the wreck in the harbour entrance, and starts casually working her way around the harbour with her guns, destroying everything. So she does, well, it's not here's Johnny, it's here's Cossack! You know, there aren't many ships which would decide that, you know, our way into a harbour, we can't get there, can't go there. Let's go straight through that wreck.
Well, I mean, then it's worth pointing out that it was Cossack that was already quite active earlier in the waters of Norway, right? Assembling
Yes,
a
she'd been
boarding
the
party and
Outmark
stuff.
incident.
So, yeah.
So she might have felt slightly responsible because, you know, after the Outmark incident, that had encouraged the Germans to think that they need to invade Norway. So perhaps this was her way of making up for that.
Yeah, so
she was under command of Sherbrooke at this time, who would later in the war win a VC for, I think, for beating up 2 German heavy cruisers again.
Okay, so
I think it was the hit from the Lutzow.
Yep, Painzel was translating this to us, and I don't know what this means, but I'm going to read it out. He says,
okay.
Cossack is a wee bit raj. Most things from Newcastle are.
Yeah.
that's not true. Yeah,
But
I mean,
she's not the only one. We're going to start next one group is led by Eskimo. And the
Can I ask a quick question? Why?
Yeah.
So the Cossacks shot up Narvik, which is still in Norwegian hands, to prevent the Germans from taking it
No,
later.
it was in German
troops
hands.
German troops had been landed by their destroyers.
Yeah.
So
There were-
basically, she was
yeah.
wiping them out.
Yeah, there were 2,000
Okay.
mountain troops in Narvik under General Environs already.
Okay.
yeah, and
Although
they
Whitworth
did.
felt if he'd had the Royal Marines he was supposed to have aboard Warspite, he felt with her 15-inch guns and the destroyer's support, he could have taken Narvik back.
The other thing you've got to remember about that particular engagement is the German troops did make a slight mistake in that they saw a stationary tribal class and decided this will be an excellent time to start shooting at it because it can't maneuver. And like, to be fair, destroyers aren't known for having particularly great armor, so the various snipers and a few other troops started opening up. And then they discovered that Cossack had, a quad 40mm pom-pom and some 4.7-inch guns. And it turns out that in a fight between a bolt-action sniper rifle and a quad 40mm anti-aircraft cannon, the anti-aircraft cannon tends to win.
It's the
It was actually slightly worse than that because at one point, let's put it this way: officially, no British sailors make it a go ashore. Of course, they're all staying on their ships. Unofficially, Cossack's crew is pointed out after the battle when they come back for having brought home some things from Narvik and possibly even some Norwegians who decided to come with them.
Oh, so they didn't go ashore in the exactly same way later on. The Royal Navy sailors didn't board Pola, right?
Yes. Just they didn't go ashore. They didn't do anything like that. They wouldn't do.
Yeah.
And in true fashion, Eskimo is leading the second group, and she's going straight down the fjord. Now, Eskimo's, how do I put this? She had been the last to arrive, and Eskimo's crew had actually, the morning of the fight, had made a point to their commanding officer of mentioning the fact that they had been slightly late because she'd been covering other technical issues, and they had tried to tell them, well, were we responsible for the H-class flotilla going in unsupported because we were late, so there wasn't a full amount of tribals here. And their commander had to reassure them not. But the Eskimos' crew were pretty worked up. And so basically they're pushing their way down through Rombach's Ford. They're pushing and pushing their way down. The Germans decided they're going to do one last ambush. Because there is one point where destroyers can only get through single file. And that you can see is literally the point at which she gets blown up.
Yeah, just on the map, the Rombach's Fjord is the tiny wee squiggle on the eastmost end. Like you can see that it's
right next to you.
Oh, it's right next to me. Where? I don't know. But it's basically the very, very narrow, very bendy thing in the east.
Mm-hmm. And it's Eskimo's got Forrester and Hero following her. So if you consider these three destroyers going in, one of them has a crew which feels slightly responsible because of because of being late. One of them is the sister ship of the ship sunk in the First Royal Navy battle in Narvik, and one of them is just the standard Royal Navy destroyer that's just normally got angry ship syndrome. Basically, I think Royal Navy destroyers, especially in 1939, 1940, have all small destroyer angry syndrome. I'm not sure what it is, but anyway. Eskimo goes first because that's what a tribal class destroyer is for. They're supposed to protect the other ships. They're supposed to go first. She goes around the corner. And the George Field, I think it's Z2, was already a bit of a blazing wreck. But at this point, she decides to launch her torpedoes as she rolls over and sinks. Now, as Eskimo comes round, she manages to avoid the torpedoes fired by Hans Ludemann, but she gets hit by Field's torpedo. It hits forward. And I'm not sure if you have a picture of it, but it literally blows off her A mount of her gun.
Do we have a picture of it?
Of what? Sorry?
I did send you some pictures.
Yeah, in the Discord.
I will try and bring the picture on screen. Give me a minute.
Anyway, so it blows off the front of her bow, and a B mount keeps firing. But what she does is she continues her turn, fires her torpedoes, and then completes her turn all the way round. So she's now got X and Y mounts aiming at the enemy, and she starts advancing sternwards towards them, still covering as Forrester and Hero come round after her. At this point, the remaining German destroyers decide that their only safety is to ram themselves ashore as hard as quickly as they can and get their crews off their ships, which they do.
Yeah, I mean,
very quickly.
It was basically the situation when the last possible ambush failed, and you had this zombie ship coming at you, even like after being hit by torpedoes. So that's.
Some of the remarks I've heard, this is my German's not that great, but basically the Germans decided the British destroyer commanders were insane. Either that or were some kind of malevolent force. They weren't quite sure. In their mind, if you lose your bow and have a stocking great big explosion that literally takes off your bow and one of your mounts, you do not then turn around and advance stern first towards the enemy. That's a good enough reason to stop and assess and maybe conduct repairs. That didn't seem to commute with HMS Eskimo's crew. And this won't be the last time Eskimo loses her bow in service to the Royal Navy during World War II. I think she's one of several destroyers in the Royal Navy which considers bows to be optional extras.
How many times did she lose a bow?
3.
Are you saying the front fell off?
How?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Wait, okay, so here we have one case of a front falling off. What was the other?
She has another run-in with, I think it's a large shell from a Italian cruiser, and she manages to bash the third one gets bashed into with another destroyer. So she has fun. She has a lot of fun.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the other thing you've got to remember when it comes to all of this is that it's not just a case of like, oh, this ship has blown up, that ship has blown up, and so forth. There is a morale component to all of this. And one of the two things that seem to affect German morale quite a bit, at least from what I've managed to find out, is one, because a lot of the ships involved in the initial advance were tribals and they have these twin 4.7-inch gun mounts, they're able to advance, and their firepower forward is roughly the same as the German firepower broadside. So they're looking at it from a perspective of this wall of ships coming at them. And despite they're all bow on, so in theory that should reduce the amount of firepower, there's actually an awful lot of firepower coming at them. So that it's kind of what I've seen some people call stress loading the mind. So they're already outnumbered, they're already outgunned, and now they've got this unexpectedly heavy deluge of shells coming in, and it doesn't give you enough time to think because you're constantly reacting to what's going on. On top of that, Warspite, even when it misses, and this was attested to by a number of German sailors, has a huge impact on the general feeling and morale of anyone who's outside or close enough to the outside of the ship to hear what's going on. Because, I mean, we've probably all heard the occasional bit of footage where you hear an artillery shell coming in. And now imagine that, now we're talking about 15-inch artillery, so it's considerably larger, considerably louder in flight, as well as obviously an explosion. And because you're in this relatively confined environment of the fjords with fairly high mountains and cliffs on either side, lots of random bays and inlets, the sound of these 15-inch shells in flight is not this kind of smooth whirring sound that you hear on a lot of things. It's rebounding and echoing and coming back again. So you're actually hearing what sounds like half a battle line's worth of shells coming in all sorts of weird distorted frequencies and timings. And then at the end of it, when a shell hits and explodes, a 15-inch explosion is big enough, you get that rebounding around and so forth. Plus the occasional rockfall from particularly high cliffs that get smacked by 15-inch high explosive. And one of the German destroyer survivors, if I translated it properly, he basically describes it as he thought the world was ending, because all he could hear was all the time. And you can imagine, and that probably like 80, 90, 100 decibels just hammering all around you. It sounds like it's coming from everywhere at once.
And the other thing you have to remember is they have exposed bridge crews like like all destroyers, and the British are using their 40mm pom-poms the whole time, and they are using them. They are actually focusing them in on bridges. So you also have to remember the tribals. They are zigzagging. So sometimes they can just bring their bow guns to bear with you, but they'll also have the X and Y turret join in. And the Germans are trying to keep sort of turning to fire back. So they're going narrower, deeper in, being forced deeper in. So their room for maneuver is constantly being restricted. So it's just a nightmare for the German destroyers. They are very brave, but they're in a situation they're completely not designed for. Whereas you can argue if any destroyer is designed for it, it's the tribals, which are 4.7-inch guns, which are fast loading, and they're carrying 8 of them in 4 double mounts. And I do call them double mounts rather than turrets. And the reason for that is because the British, to save weight because of the treaty limitations, couldn't have found that if they fitted a turret, it would have such thin armor, it would just be adding to the shrapnel. So if they put a mount, which had some hydraulic assistance but was mostly man-moved, the gun crew would actually shift it round and turn it round, they can actually put a thick chunk of steel as a shield around the part which is pointing towards the enemy, which would actually be useful. So, that's why they have the mounts they do. They also found that if they did have such a system, any gun which was a shell which was big enough to pierce the front armor would probably keep on going and blow up somewhere off the far side of the ship. So there again, that would help protect the crew. It would not be then slowed down or stopped by any back on the turret. So it was, there are reasons for this, but that's why they're called mounts, not turrets.
Yeah, it's worth pointing that not all mounts are turrets, but all turrets are mounts.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Oh, God. Okay. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Technically.
Yes, technically. In any case, I just realized now in the description of the battle and actually of the effect of the Cossacks, was this one of the reasons why the later German wartime production destroyers were switching to the twin mount on the front?
Yes,
because that was also one of the things that was kind of inconvenient for the earlier types, that they had 4 guns and only one was on the bow, right? One was amidships and 2 were aft.
The Germans basically revamped their destroyer construction based on this experience. Narvik is a traumatic experience for the German Navy. They don't just lose destroyers. Losing the ships is one thing. That's worrying enough. Losing those experienced crew, that's a far bigger problem. Losing their experienced officers. They lose a lot of senior officers, either wounded or killed. It wipes out a whole generation, basically, of experienced senior destroyer officers.
Yeah. Is it actually even possible? Because after the Battle of Narvik, the crews were drafted into the improvised infantry unit, right?
It was actually useful to the Germans. They were able to do that because the Norwegian northern troops start counterattacking and eventually get joined by some British and French troops. And if they hadn't had the reinforcements of the crews, they would have not been able to hold on as long as they did.
And but are there any estimates like how many or how serious losses did the destroyer crew suffer while fighting on land, or
Well, the army basically used them as cheap cannon fodder, so you can figure out how many losses they do. They're really the army really don't appreciate what they're dealing with. To them, they think small ships must have the less elite crews.
oh,
When if you think about it, it's the reverse.
that's actually that kind of was fitting for all the navies involved, right? The light forces were generally kind of more aggressive and more.
So they're more
They-
disposable.
They
to
have to
replace.
be in a way more elite. Let's be honest. If you're a destroyer officer, if you're an officer on a destroyer, and you go, "Oh, I don't know about guns," or "Oh, that's someone else's department," your CO is going to look around at you and go, "Excuse me, I have exactly 8 officers on this ship. If you don't know your section, you're frankly useless for me."
Shall we transition to questions?
Yeah,
I think
probably
we
good
have
Yes?
just to add a quick final. So as mentioned, the ground forces around Narvik were fighting on because obviously it was quite problematic to get their allied troops on a short notice, and the fighting went on and on until basically most of the southern part of Norway was run over, and until the little kerfuffle called Battle of France started happening, and then both the French and the British had more pressing issues than holding on to area around Narvik. So basically then the remaining troops in the area were evacuated, which also influenced the Dunkirk evacuation, right? Because a lot of destroyers and stuff were needed to get the troops from Norway safely back.
Okay.
Lots of
As yes.
Yeah.
Can I? Okay. So, as with every week, you guys have submitted some questions. We're going to go through
Yes.
them. Our experts are going to answer, and if you have any follow-up questions, any additional things you want to know about what we're talking about, please feel free to @World of Warships in any of the chats that you're watching in. So, question.
And I'll just quickly comment for Peter on the Facebook. It's a shame that this episode is not on the naval campaign of Gallipoli. Well, we have like one episode per month, so we are trying to always pick up something from the month, preferably. But maybe we will get to the Battle of Gallipoli as well, even though it generally involved ships only on one side, so it's ships
Yeah, it's
versus
more-
coastal forts.
It's more of an invasion
Oh.
than a naval battle.
To be fair, the Turkish Navy does occasionally, well, the Ottoman Navy does occasionally actually get involved, and especially later on in the campaign after the Dardanelles, when the British are launching the more conventional Palestine campaign and various other things, they do make several forays out that cause considerable trouble, and in one point actually sink 2 British monitors.
Yep.
Guys on YouTube, please try to stick to English in YouTube chat. Otherwise, we will have to remove your speaking privileges.
Yes.
Let's over to question number 1. Question number 1 was submitted by Creamboat Willie. Great name there. What size guns were used by the coastal defenses in Ofotfjord? Was there any attempt to bomb them by the Luftwaffe prior to Blücher et al.'s movement into the area?
So this is Oslo Fjord. This is down south, elsewhere in the Norwegian campaign. Oscarborg Fortress has a couple of 11-inch guns. Well, actually has 3, but only 2 of them are operational because of shortage of crews. It's got some completely ancient Whitehead torpedo launchers, and it's got the fortification. Both Oscarborg Fortress itself is not just a fortress; it's a main fortification, and it's got a couple of subsidiary satellite gun batteries. And then there's some further defences further down Oslo Fjord, which do a little bit of firing, but not really all that much. And those secondary guns are they're a mix of 4.7, 6-inch, various other mid, sort of what you would call heavy destroyer or light cruiser caliber weapons. But in terms of bombing them with the Luftwaffe, the main problem you have is that this is all happening simultaneously. So the invasion of Denmark is happening at the same time as the invasion of Norway, and all the various the initial landing in Narvik is happening the same night as the attempted landing in Oslo, and they can't bring the Luftwaffe into play just yet, because at this point the Luftwaffe is still based in sort of the German mainland, and they have to, in order to get there to support and bomb the Oskarburg fortress, they would have to fly over Denmark and then over the short bit of sea bit that separates Denmark and Norway, and then to Oslo. And that would kind of give the game away, because the Danish would kind of notice all these bombers flying overhead, and B, there's an invasion of Denmark going on. The Luftwaffe is in demand there, plus range issues that make it very difficult to get all the timings right, and it's all at night. And given that the Oslo Fjord is actually even narrower and more confined in its narrowest parts than the Narvik Fjord is, if you then try and bomb the fortress commensurate with the time when your ships are sailing up the fjord and potentially in danger, and you're doing all of this at night, there's probably as much an even chance of you hitting your own ships as there is of you hitting any particular gun emplacement. Yes, Stukas could probably do it a lot more accurately, but one, nighttime, they can't really dive bomb at night, and two, they don't have the range to get from Germany to Oslo and back again. Once Denmark is occupied and they have control of the Danish airfields, then they can offer Luftwaffe air support in a much bigger way to the Norwegian campaign, and Luftwaffe aerial operations become a big problem for the Royal Navy. But in this opening 48 hour period, they don't have those bases to use just yet.
And let's also be honest that the Germans' Operation Wurstbung is the most Hail Marys of Hail Marys known to mankind. It's, they're going up against Norway, which is theoretically has 6 divisions of troops, and Denmark, which is 2 divisions, so roughly between them supposedly 70-odd thousand soldiers, and the Allies, who will commit 35,000 soldiers. And in the whole operation, not just the invasion, but the whole way through Operation Wurstbung, between Norway and Denmark, the Germans will never send in more than 1 motorized rifle brigade, 1 artillery battalion, and 9 divisions. They will... Most of the tanks, well, they use Panzerfaust for Denmark, and a few other nice things, but again, not much.
Can you just say that again for my enjoyment one more time, please?
They use Panzerfaust for the most of Denmark. Sorry. And this is going to make you really laugh, because I'm going to try and pronounce the name of this tank.
Oh, I know what you are trying to go for. The
Neubaufahrzeug.
Neubaufahrzeug.
God.
Neubaufahrzeug tank, which is what they deploy to Norway, which basically it's a failure. The German army even consider it a terrible tank. They're going, we have them, we should send something to Norway. Do you want to send anything that we want to lose? No. We got these terrible tanks here. Send them! They have worse reliability issues than the freaking tanks the British were using in World War One.
Repeat after me. Neubaufahrzeug.
Neubaufahrzeug.
Okay, should we go to the next question?
Yes.
Let's go. Question number 2 from El Mocassino. What was the Norwegian naval contribution to the Battle of Narvik? Did their contribution have any significant effect on the outcome of the battle?
Well, you've got the first Battle of Narvik,
which could have had more of an impact if their torpedo boats and small boats had gone out to assist the coastal battleships, because then they might have had a chance, because their main problem with the destroyers, well, as you said, was they couldn't see them and they were kind of unable to maneuver around them. So if the destroyers had to deal with the small torpedo boats as well, they might have had a chance, but they didn't have crews available for them because they hadn't called up the reserves early enough, because the Norwegian government were idiots. Sorry, they were.
So that's basically it, because once Narvik is under German control, the Germans basically there's not really much of the Norwegian Navy left at that point in Narvik. There's a few little patrol boats. Most of them end up going down with splinter damage to various air raids and incidental crossfire from the first battle of Narvik with Warburton Lee's flotilla. So yeah, at that point there really isn't all that much for the poor old Norwegian Navy to do. There are a few other elements of the Norwegian Navy, some fairly nice destroyers and submarines and such. But much like the Polish Navy, when it becomes very clear to them that this conflict is not really going to be going their way, they first of all kind of back off to join up with British forces at sea, or just decide, you know what, we're going to go elsewhere. And much like the Polish Navy at the very beginning of the war, those will form the core of the Free Norwegian Navy, which will later show up with all sorts of fun and games to cause problems for the Germans. For example, there's a Free Norwegian ship at the Battle of North Cape, which goes after Scharnhorst with a pretty much the same kind of menace that Piron went after Bismarck.
There was also a Norwegian destroyer sunk during the D-Day operation, during the Neptune. And speaking of Polish, actually, that's also one of the things that are kind of not probably known nearly well enough. That basically first naval shots of the entire Norwegian kerfuffle were torpedoes fired by the Polish submarine Orzel. I apologize to all my Polish friends for this pronunciation, but the Polish submarine came across one of the ships carrying troops for the invasion of Norway and sunk her.
And this, what I find amazing is the Germans still managed to win in Norway. They really shouldn't have. And you also have the most famous group, the group which gets most forgotten, but which I think should be most famous of the Free Norwegian forces, were the dog boats. They're the Fairmile D boat unit they produce, because they do so much great work for Special Operations Executive and throughout World War II. They really are critical.
Okay. By the way, Eric pointed out that on land they fared much better and actually won the first major battle against the German army. But on the water, not so much at that point. Okay, let's go back to our questions. Question number 3, submitted by Mofton, and I have no idea how to pronounce this, but Ger H. Hars, the German invasion of Norway, postulates that if Admiral Whitworth had intervened more forcefully, then he could have forced the cruiser Penelope and the 4 tribal-class destroyers to go in with 2nd DF
Destroyer Flotilla
on 9th or 10th of April. Given the huge increase in force that would have represented the outcome for the first Battle of Narvik could potentially have been more one-sided in favor of the British, or the delay and inclusion of a larger ship could have had negative consequences. If you had been Whitworth, would you have reinforced Warburton Lee? So I think we're going to have to do one each for this. Drachinifel, would you have reinforced Warburton Lee?
Given the options, I probably would have. But it's a very close case of timing. Okay, someone's at my door. The talks were speaking of timing. So it's a case of timing, and they could have maybe got a couple of the tribals in at the same time that Warburton Lee wanted to go in, but one of the issues was that if you were going to send in Penelope and the other tribals, it would have required time, and because it was to organize, and because it was so close after the German invasion, they didn't think they had the time to wait.
Okay.
Apparently, the Twitch thinks that I cannot agree whether it's a pizza at your door or a Spanish Inquisition.
So what's the Spanish Inquisition?
Nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition.
We'll see. Now we need to know the answer.
Ooh.
Okay,
Pizza?
We'll give him a minute. Let's head over. Dr. Clarke, would you have reinforced Warburton Lee?
You see, if you're looking with hindsight, you know that's where the Germans are. If you're looking with hindsight, you know that's where the Germans are. So hopefully you can hear me.
Yes. We can hear you. But I was asking. I want you to commit to a yes or no answer.
No, because if I'm Admiral Whitworth, I don't know where the Germans are, and I've got that force sticking back in case any of the other smaller forces. Actually, the force sent into Narvik is the largest force he sends in. Some of the other fjords are being searched by a single destroyer. So, if they get into trouble and find the Germans actually where they are, he needs that force back to be able to redirect it. And in hindsight, we know he was right, but he did send a whole flotilla in there. And their whole aim was to hit and run. They weren't supposed to try and take it back. They were supposed to just hit and run. And they do hit and run. And yes, the fight, broadly speaking, is a draw overall in the end in the first Battle of Narvik. But then the British turn up in the second Battle of Narvik, for us anyway, third battle by the Norwegian standard, and the German force is pretty much wiped out at sea. And yes, if Whitworth is quite correct then, if he'd had enough Marines with him and he'd had enough enough sort of the ability to do it, if he'd had the Marines with him, he could probably have taken Narvik back. Because let's be honest, after Cossack has taken out all their mortars and most of their heavy machine guns and all their snipers, there isn't going to be much resistance if they storm into Narvik.
Okay. Okay, Tucky?
Yes. I have to agree with this. Basically, the rate on the Warburton Lee rate on Narvik was basically let's say reconnaissance in force. So if you submitted more forces to that, then you risk that any of these destroyers in the side fjords actually finds the enemy and cannot really deal with them, and you have no backup. So yeah, it was like...
It wasn't a good situation. Yeah. It's basically which is the least bad choice.
Yeah. Okay. There we go. Question solved. No, he did the right thing. Let's head over to the next question from Mr. Bondorama. Were the torpedo tubes on the destroyers reloadable, or were they only reloaded at dock?
Yes, they were reloadable.
Yeah. But did they?
It wasn't easy, but they were able to do it.
Did they actually carry the reloads on board?
Well, they do, but there is a debate on how many reloads they carry and how many they're supposed to carry. Technically, the only ones who officially carry reloads are supposed to be the Japanese. The British do carry a few reloads, but not a full set. But it does seem that they do carry them. And I say this because when you look at some of the results of torpedoes being fired...
More torpedoes than tubes?
More, yes,
yes, basically, they fire 12... sometimes you've got a tribal-class destroyer, and it technically is supposed to have one quad launcher of torpedoes, and so you finish because it carries no reloads, it would fire 4 torpedoes. But they actually fire, they come back from operation, they fired 6 or 7. And that means that they could have only done that if they managed to reload.
Yeah. It's possible to reload at sea, but you need it to be calm conditions and ideally people not shooting at you, because torpedoes are rather big, rather heavy things. So unless you have the dedicated reload mechanisms that the Japanese do, you basically just need a bunch of very strong people to lift them up and feed them in tail first to your empty torpedo launcher, which is understandably something of a time-consuming activity.
Yes.
Plus,
also, basically, you need someone as strong as our friendly hammer breaker.
Oh my.
I keep it.
Yeah, but
as we all know, this is what Drachinifel does to hammers.
Yeah,
don't ever get on his bedside. Like he will win. But another point is that the torpedoes also present quite a fire hazard because they have
full
to
of
be
explosives.
Sorry,
because they're full of explosives.
More than that, like explosives. They take effort to explode. That's like they usually just burn out, and it's okay. The gunpowder is the cordite is the worst thing, but the torpedoes are also full of fuel and some oxidizer. So that's not a good combination. And obviously, the more powerful you want your torpedo engine to be, the more volatile fuel you have to have, or the more enriched compressed air, or even pure oxygen you have to have. So that's also why the Japanese torpedoes were kind of a mixed blessing, because you had a lot of fuel, a lot of oxygen. If you get hit, it doesn't end up well. But the same
a lot
applies.
of Japanese commanders had a habit of launching all their torpedoes the moment they thought they were going to get in a gunfight, whether they could see a target or not, just because it was safer.
The worst thing you can have, assuming you don't have like pure oxygen in your torpedo tanks, is actually not an instant detonation. The worst possible thing you can have is a torpedo that gets hit, and the launcher gets hit, or the torpedo gets hit and causes some kind of breach or premature detonation of the launching charge that fires the torpedo. Because at that point, your worst case scenario is you have a torpedo somewhere on your ship, possibly on deck, possibly inside your ship, and because it's launched, its warhead activation mechanism has started whirring, its safety, and people have probably seen various videos where someone's knocked the cap off of a compressed air cylinder like a scuba tank or something and seen the amount of destruction it can do. Now imagine something weighing several metric tons that's also got a bunch of highly volatile fuel in it that's now spraying highly volatile fuel as it goes Catherine wheeling along your ship, also spraying lots of compressed air onto that burning fuel, and then at the end of it, potentially the warhead goes, "Oh yes, I believe I have traveled far enough. I will now activate." And then the next substantial part of your ship bit that it hits, you now have several hundred kilos of explosive going off inside your ship. It doesn't happen very often, fortunately, because that is the absolute worst case scenario. But when it does, it's very, very bad.
Yes.
At one of the battles during the Guadalcanal campaign, a US destroyer basically has that scenario. It ends up with a torpedo wedged in its funnel, and the only reason it survives the engagement is thanks to the Bureau of Ordnance having refused at that point to fix the detonator. So the safety winds down, the burning fuel burns out, and then there's just a click, and the warhead doesn't go off because the detonator's malfunctioned. So they go back to port with a tail end of torpedoes.
The Board of Ordnance for their inefficiency.
So they sail home with a torpedo tail sticking out of their funnel.
There's a comment from Yamato 8125206 on Twitch. I heard that the US Navy only started to have reloadable torpedoes only in DDs in the beginning of the 1960s. Well, it's more complicated. Basically, the early destroyers, especially the one with just like single torpedo tubes, usually had reloads because, you have 3 torpedo tubes, you have plenty of deck space, you reload them. Then, in between the war, the philosophy switched rather to large batteries of torpedo tubes. Look at in the game at Benham, the 2 sets of quad torpedo tubes on each side, with the idea that you don't need to reload if you have the other side of the ship still loaded. So, like, you launch one salvo, you turn, you launch the other. Even though there were also such crazy ideas as like being able to launch all torpedoes at once in a like massive forward-going spread, but that didn't really work out that well. During the war, due to increases in AA, usually these torpedo tubes were reduced to just 3 or even just 1 set of torpedoes. The Fletchers were designed primarily for the gunfighting, so they were not designed for reloads. But for example, I believe the Atlanta class light cruisers were designed with slots to hold the reload torpedoes, even though the reloads were very exposed. They didn't even have a box to protect the torpedoes from the elements. They were just like in the holders. And then after the World War II, the destroyers began to focus more on guided weapons, including guided anti-submarine torpedoes, and the anti-submarine torpedoes are also much smaller than the anti-ship torpedoes, so suddenly you have space for reloads and you can stay in the fight longer.
Okay.
So it's complicated.
So it's complicated, but in essence, yes, they can. Yes.
Basically, reloading depends on how brave your captain, your destroyer commander is.
To be fair,
because you can find space, you can carry reloads of torpedoes, And
but-
if you're the thing is, most of the times you find the British having reloads on their torpedoes is mostly when you're talking about ships which are doing Arctic convoy runs or the Mediterranean, where they expect they could be involved in long-running fights. And honestly, the question is not a case of do we want to carry more torpedoes? It's a case of do we risk not carrying more torpedoes and not trying to reload?
Okay. Well, I mean, if there's one good place to reload a torpedo, it's probably in a fjord, at least if you're not being shot at. Okay, let's move to the next question from M. Diggy Dog, a regular of submitting questions to Armchair Admirals. How silly is the idea of driving a battleship up a fjord? Were the defective torpedoes the only reason the Brits didn't get massacred?
As far as the surface action group is concerned, i.e. the German destroyers, sending a battleship up the fjord with a destroyer escort screen ahead of it and aerial recon is actually a relatively sensible move at this point, because between the destroyers and the aerial recon, they can either spot the torpedo launches or, worst case scenario, absolute worst case, throw themselves into the path of those torpedoes. But and also they know the Germans have expended a bunch of torpedoes in the first battle. But what they don't know, and where most of the torpedoes fired at Warspite actually end up coming from, is that there are U-boats present. And if those U-boats had had functional torpedoes, then yes, Warspite would have been hit by a number of them, because there's well over half a dozen torpedoes that, by all German accounts, seem to have run fairly straight and true, but either don't detonate or detonate too early, and therefore Warspite is secure and doesn't actually end up being hit. But if you've got those torpedoes functioning, then yeah, it would have been a very bad idea to send the battleship up into such confined waters, because it gives the submarines perfect shots, because again, it's confined waters. They're not moving the battleship's not moving particularly fast, doesn't have much room to maneuver, so it's a relatively easy shot to calculate. The only mistake apart from the torpedoes, I think, was the Germans sent in basically any U-boat that was in the area. So U-64, which has the rather interesting appellation of being one of the very, very few U-boats ever sunk by a dive bombing attack from a float plane equipped Swordfish, is a Type 9, which is one of the bigger subs. And it's caught on the surface. If it had been a Type 7, maybe it wouldn't have been on the surface. Maybe it still would have been. Who knows? But even if it had been caught on the surface and sunk, the loss of a Type 7 would have been less of an impact for the Kriegsmarine than the loss of a Type 9. Putting something the size of a Type 9 in a fjord, not really... It's not really any saner than sending a battleship into a fjord if you happen to know there are submarines waiting.
Okay. So
it's one of those
not so
things.
silly.
If you don't send the Warspite, you are setting up for another slightly more heavily armed version of the first battle. You might send Penelope, but really Penelope is not much of an increase in firepower over the Tribal class destroyers. Yes, she's got 6 6-inch guns. Yes, they're lovely, but considering the firepower of the Tribals, she's not and the relative maneuverability of the Tribals versus the light cruiser, even our Refuser class, is not that massive. It's not that small. There's not much of an advantage. Whereas Warspite goes up, she's got her secondaries. They're going to be blasting away. And she's got her primaries. And she's got the fear factor. And she's also got Admiral Whitworth aboard, who's basically going to... Well, as we've been over in the past with the Tribals, they do have a habit of trying to exceed their orders. And he may have thought that he might send them up there to try and destroy the German destroyers, and find that Narvik had been recaptured by a load of sailors accidentally. Oh, what? Did we just take a port? Oh, we're sorry. Kind of like Altmark incident and various other things in Tribal. Basically, if you send Royal Navy destroyers unattended to go off and do a fight, do not expect it to come back exactly the way you expect it to be. You'll have an idea of what they're supposed to do, but you also know they will try and exceed that. You add tribal destroyers and their crews into the mix, and you will have the fact that they will exceed it in the most eccentric and interesting random way possible.
Okay.
Plus, obviously, there is-
I believe sending Warspite in there was it took balls of steel. It was a good.
Yeah, I mean it's kind of logical even in the in the military sense. Like, if you want to win and reduce your casualties as much as possible, you try to hit the enemy with an overwhelming strength, because that usually means that you can win faster than if you just applied the minimum necessary strength. It's like, yeah, there's no such thing as overkill.
Okay. Let's head over to question number 6. Question number 6 is from Harry Unliving 2. Did the HMS Furious participate in the battle? How did she do? I don't think she did.
No.
Why did you guys let this question through screening?
There were Furious was operating in the area. She did send in a couple of air raids.
Okay.
And one of those air raids, that's where you got some of the splinter damage that sent one of the Norwegian patrol boats to the bottom when it was just moored up in Narvik harbour. But they were those raids were incidental to the battles. They're not happening at the same time.
Okay.
Basically,
So not a
she's
bad
doing
question
other
after all.
things. She's busy.
Okay. Cool. Easy question though. Question number 7. Gravity Fold 618 is asking, how fortunate was the Royal Navy that the German torpedoes on their submarines all seemed to malfunction when fired due to magnetic detonator systems' inability to operate in the northern latitude?
Okay. The thing is, you've also had the fact that it is Warspite being fired at. So we've covered this quite a bit. We haven't mentioned the fact that Warspite does seem of any ship to have plot armor. So in all her history, she has these random things. So you can't hold it all against the German torpedoes and their detonators. There is the fact the particular battleship involved is Warspite. If it had been, I don't know, any other British battleship, they might have actually, one of them might have worked. You know, there is a randomness with Warspite's history. You're not quite sure what it is, but she seems to get through things which other ships don't.
Okay.
So, yes, I think we've covered the detonators quite well and gone through that, but this point needs to be made is that this is Warspite involved. I don't like the idea of plot armor in real life, but if any ship does how you can make the case for having actually got plot armor in real life, it is probably Warspite.
Shame that they scrapped her. That would have been a grand old museum ship.
They didn't even scrap her properly. She ran aground off Cornwall on the way to be scrapped, and they ended up having to scrap her in Cornwall. And there are huge chunks of Warspite's armor all around various places in Cornwall. If you want to go and see them, you just go and see, what's this huge, great big, thick piece of steel here? Oh yeah, that's off our HMS Warspite. What? There's huge slabs of armor grade steel all over Cornwall from Warspite.
Interesting. Yeah, but I heard about that. Very sad. Let's move on. Question number 8 from Dryalga. During the Battle of Narvik, the U-boat U-64 was sunk by a fairly swordfish launched by HMS Warspite. Was it common for any warship that was not an aircraft carrier or seaplane tender to launch a plane for direct offensive purposes against enemy ships rather than for spotting?
Normally, the scout aircraft was launched for the purpose of scouting. It's not particularly common for a scout aircraft to engage in combat, partly because, well, let's face it, the scout aircraft are usually, well, they have to be amphibious, so they're either float planes or seaplanes, which are not exactly known for their combat capabilities. And there's only one of them usually aloft, even if a battleship might carry more than one. And so if it's lost, if it's shot down, the battleship no longer has that scouting and reporting capability, because they do have radios to report fall of shot as well. So they're much more valuable remaining in a scout format rather than trying to engage in combat against an enemy target. However,
there were no replacements on board?
it depends on the ship. It depends on the ship, and it depends also on the capacity they've actually got. So, for example, a King George V class battleship carries walrus amphibians. Theoretically, it's got space in its hangar for 4. Most of the time during the war, they're carrying 2. But if you lose an aircraft, even if you have a replacement, you've then got to get that replacement out of the hangar, onto the catapult, get the flight crew ready and brief, get it warmed up, launch it. It's got to get altitude. By that time, you've at minimum you've lost a huge chunk of observational time. With Narvik, you have the situation of the anti-aircraft defense. Well, it's not even strong enough to deter a float plane equipped swordfish, and they spot an opportunity of there's a submarine. We have some pathetically tiny anti-submarine bombs, which are only really one step above a hand grenade with some fins attached.
They're 80-pound bombs.
Yeah, you could literally have dropped it 6 feet away from the sub, and between the pressure hull and the external hull, it probably wouldn't have troubled it all that much. It's only because it gets a direct hit that the sub is even in any particular danger. So it's a very unique scenario.
It is also the slowest dive bomb to ever take place in Norway, probably.
I mean, a strong updraft, and you may well have invented the world's first VTOL bomber.
Yeah, but I mean, theoretically, this was also one of the jobs those scout planes were supposed to do, like anti-submarine patrol, apart from
It's
spotting
why they
and
carry the
recon,
bombs
but-
in the first
yeah.
place. But there's also the fact that when Warspite was in the fjords, they were actually worried once they got further in that if they tried to launch any more scout aircraft, they might hit the side of the fjord.
Going up against subs is a slightly different thing. Submarines generally don't have that much ability to fight back against aircraft, whereas normally with scout planes, when they're launched, the majority of the time they're going after surface targets, surface shipping, possibly shore installations. That's where you have most of the anti-aircraft, and so you shape your general operational perimeters around what you most expect to encounter. If you happen to encounter a submarine, you have a few little bombs you can throw at it, but you're not actively going to be launching your scout aircraft to do that particular hunter-killer mission, because to be perfectly honest, if you've got to a point where you're launching a battleship scout aircraft to go hunting submarines, you probably have much larger problems to deal with, like the fact you apparently have no carrier escort, you have no destroyer escort, you have nothing other than that.
Yeah, but like imagine yourself being in the shoes of that pilot. You're out there scouting, and there's a submarine on the surface. I mean, like, how could you?
It's
not?
a gift from heaven.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. If you, it's an incidental thing. If you spot it, great, fantastic. There's tea and medals and cakes by the end of the day. But whilst they might hope to spot it, as I say, you're not going to be sending people up there with the express intention of launching airstrikes if you're using battleship scout aircraft.
Yeah.
There's also an aircraft which I think it was it a couple of days before? Was it a day before, or was it a couple of days later? But there's another incident which involves probably a swordfish operating from Warspite over Norway. In that there is a swordfish which reports engaging an enemy aircraft and having to fire at it, but getting away, and it doesn't see what happens. And all we know is that there is a fighter which then reports back to German High Command he was shot down by a Spitfire. Well, A, there were no Spitfires deployed to Norway. B, the only aircraft operating in that area was a Swordfish from Warspite. So the odds are one of the Warspite Swordfish actually got an air-to-air kill later on. And that was something else they weren't supposed to do. But you must remember, the German fighters were never shot down by Swordfish. It was always Spitfires. Always a Spitfire.
There was actually a follow-up question here from Zika on YouTube. He's asking, would the scout plane even see that sub on periscope depth? I think I can answer that probably from my side. Speaking as someone like who spent a lot of time on the sea, it depends on the water, I think. Because if the water's reasonably clear, you definitely see the submarine. If it's really, really choppy and really murky, maybe not. I'm not sure. What do you guys think?
Plus,
The
when
Norwegian Fjords are lovely.
Yeah. And
They are really
when you are looking from above, then you again have a different perspective. So in shallow water, That's also why basically submarines didn't like operations in the Mediterranean, because it can be very shallow in places, and that's not a good thing.
Yeah, but we're talking about periscope depth, right? So I mean, you could definitely see the periscope if she's got it up. But for everything else, it depends a little bit on the conditions. Yeah, Norwegian fjords are not known for being shallow.
No, but
They are not known for being shallow, but still they are
Shallow in parts.
shallower than the open ocean, especially in the further away part from the sea where the battle was taking place. So
Okay. Let's move on. Question from Hetman Mazepa. How crucially did German destroyer losses at Narvik contribute to the eventual cancellation of Operation Sea Lion?
There's a lot more problems with Sea Lion than just a lack of destroyers. A lot. But I think probably a broader answer is that the loss of the destroyers at Narvik and losses of other German ships in the Norwegian campaign badly cripple the Germans' ability to use their ships in other campaigns and other theatres throughout the rest of the war, because it's a good chunk, it's around about, depending on exactly whether you count the little sort of dinky few 100-ton torpedo boats as destroyers or not, but by most estimates, it's something around about 50% of the German destroyer force is rendered inoperable or destroyed by the Norwegian campaign. And that means that when they're going after all sorts of other things, so when you're giving escort to your surface forces going raiding, like in Operation Berlin or Operation Rheinebung, you don't have the destroyers to give them a full-on escort, so you have to rely more on secrecy. You don't have the destroyers to spare, so you can't even think of sending one or two of your longer-range destroyers out there with support from supply ships. You can't have destroyer flotillas waiting off of France to receive your raiders coming back again. You're very, very, very limited, and even when you have the campaign against Russia, where they're using some of the larger German ships to provide support, coastal bombardment support, you run into problems there because you've got a limited number of destroyers. You know the Russians have submarines and the Russians have destroyers, so you can only send out a limited force because you have limited screening capabilities. And the same thing later on with the Arctic convoys, when they're trying to send out Tirpitz and Scharnhorst and Admiral Scheer. They only have a small number of destroyers available even then for screening purposes, which means that A, they're a bit more cagey about sending out their capital ships, but B, when you think about the Battle of the North Cape, Scharnhorst is caught alone by the British ships. It went out with the destroyer force, but that limited number of destroyers has been sent off to look elsewhere for the British convoy. If Narvik hasn't happened, if the Norway campaign doesn't result in this massacre of the German destroyer force, then potentially instead of having 4 destroyers, Scharnhorst could have had 8 or 10 destroyers. Would that have saved Scharnhorst? Maybe, maybe not. We don't know. We'd have to try and run the war game, the scenario at some point. But at the very least, if she'd had been able to spare a couple of destroyers to lead her through, well, even if they ran into Norfolk, Sheffield, and Belfast, even if they get sunk, Scharnhorst then has the opportunity to disengage intact with a forward radar intact, at which point she maybe spots Duke of York coming the other way and doesn't get plastered at point blank range by a full-scale battleship. And Bismarck, for example, Bismarck is hoping on the Luftwaffe to come and save her at the end of her voyage heading back to France. Now, would that have gone differently if there'd been enough German destroyers so that they could have a flotilla based in France? They know Bismarck's coming. They could have sent a flotilla of destroyers out to meet her and provide escort back home, maybe even give her a bit of a tow. Again, would that have saved her? We don't know. Again, it would be a scenario, but it would be a possibility that could have happened. So all these things, there's loads and loads of second order effects from the fact that the Germans lose so many destroyers in this campaign.
Yeah, but as already mentioned, it wasn't just destroyers, because it was also heavy cruiser and light cruiser lost.
Yeah,
it was a heavy cruiser with a huge gaping hole in her side from HMS Glowworm. And the Scharnhorst and Gneisenau also didn't get away scot-free from their encounter. And moreover, there was a lot of issues that were found with them. I did read the English translation of action report of a Scharnhorst gunnery officer from the Caesar turret, from the aft turret. And it was very sad reading from his perspective, because he even specifically mentioned that he spent half of the battle not observing the enemy, observing the fall of the shots, but fixing broken things in the turret, especially broken things with regards to a linkage to the central fire director. So he actually spent most of the battle firing under local control, because there was no proper linkage. And the same applied to the AA guns. Basically, both the Terrible Twins had to spend quite a long time in the dock after the Norwegian campaign, while the shipyard workers were actually just simplifying them. They were reducing they pulled the extreme amount of various electric and signal cables out, because they were just adding to the complexity. So basically, the ships after the Norway campaign were in... the Kriegsmarine was not really in much of a shape to try to venture anywhere in the North Sea in force.
But the one thing you've got to remember is damaged ships can be fixed. Sunk ships can't. So Lutzow damaged, Hipper's damaged, both Scharnhorst damaged, but they all do get repaired, and they all do end up back out at sea doing various raids. Hipper does raiding. So the Scharnhorst obviously do Operation Berlin. Lutzow does some raiding. Lutzow actually lasts, of all of those, lasts the longest, only gets tallboyed right at the end of the war. So they still have a future. Losing Blucher probably really doesn't help, because that's 1/3 of all the Hipper class cruisers they'll ever complete.
Especially not in such a silly manner.
Yes. But the thing is, you've got Prince Eugen, you've got Hipper, they can do things instead of Blucher. And let's be totally honest, the Königsbergs and the Leipzigs, they're not... the fact that some of them were lost doesn't really affect German oceanic naval campaigns, because they're not really ocean-capable ships.
Yeah, but it does impact any operations within the North Sea and...
I wouldn't even take the Königsbergs out for prolonged operations in the North Sea.
North Sea is not
they're
a hospitable
basically...
place.
Sending the Königsbergs out for prolonged operations in the North Sea and then running into bad North Sea weather is a good way to get an interesting Königsberg named Pretzel coming back home. They are really lightly built. There's a reason that the survivors are basically confined to the Baltic for the rest of the war. But as I say, the thing is, Blucher it's annoying, but you can recover from it with your other heavy cruisers. It's the destroyers that really kill the Kriegsmarine's operational flexibility, because it means they can't escort ships they want to escort, they can't support ships they want to escort, and they can't go and rescue ships that they want to rescue.
And you have to remember also that the destroyers lost were their newest and their best crewed. So they lose disproportionately the parts of their destroyer force they really rely on. And let's be honest, they lose Bronte, and Bronte was the guy who was building the destroyer force for the Kriegsmarine. Without him, you lose the thing that's actually been campaigning and arguing for your destroyers.
Yeah, because when you look at the... Sorry.
Yeah. That even before the Norwegian campaign, Kriegsmarine lost 2 more destroyers in a friendly fire incident with the Luftwaffe, so that's also doesn't help.
No, I know, but the thing is, when you look at the officers that are left, because Bronte, as Dr. Clark said, could have gone on to many great things in various commands. Bay, who would basically end up leading Scharnhorst to her death, Bay is present at Narvik. He's in command of some of the destroyers that come in the first Battle of Narvik from away from the Narvik harbour. He doesn't do particularly well. He's not the world's best officer, period, let alone destroyer officer or capital ship officer. He's not the best thing the Germans have ever produced. He by rights should have made a lot better of that second part of the first engagement than he did. And you kind of see that the rest of his career, he's mostly being promoted based on seniority, not particularly on capability. And although there are other circumstances that cause Scharnhorst to be lost, you can make a case that Bay's command style and his command decisions do have a fairly large contributing factor as to exactly the circumstances of how Scharnhorst gets sunk. So, whilst there are other things going on there as well, if Bronte had survived and he'd been in charge of Scharnhorst, I don't think you would have had the Battle of the North Cape going down quite the one-sided manner that it did, at minimum. And he could possibly even have extricated Scharnhorst from that situation.
He was certainly one of the better German commanders, and this is the thing. When you lose a ship, that is something. But it comes back to the British, what Cunningham said about Crete. A ship, that's 3 years. A crew, that's 30 years lost.
Yes.
A tradition, that's 300 years lost. And you have to you have to build those things up. The Germans didn't have that many 30 years. They certainly didn't have enough 300 years tradition. They had traditions. They had been building up a navy, but it had gone through World War One and then the interwar period, and neither had been that good for morale. So the few good commanders they've got are worth their weight in gold. You lose them, you lose those 30 years. Bronte had been in the service since 1914. Losing him in 1940, that means you've lost 26 years of destroyer experience.
Yeah,
you can't replace that.
No, and unfortunately for the Kriegsmarine, quite a lot of their good commanders are either lost in action or fall victim to various internal politics relatively early in the war. Bronte obviously killed in action at Narvik. Marshal, who's the admiral in charge of the Scharnhorst during the campaign, it's on his initiative that Glorious is found and sunk. He is basically effectively relieved of command because he is seen by the Kriegsmarine as too aggressive, which is hilarious. And as a result, Admiral Lütjens takes over, and Lütjens is the one who takes the Scharnhorst out for Operation Berlin. Marshal doesn't, and then because of the success of Berlin, Lütjens then gets to be aboard Bismarck, and Bismarck, amongst all the other things, again is another contrast in command styles, because Lütjens, for all of his relative success at Berlin, is far more conservative and far more risk averse compared to Marshal.
And far more signal happy, which makes the Royal Navy so happy with tracking down Bismarck. And
again, like with Scharnhorst sinking, you can't pin it just on one man, but Lütjens really does not make life easy for Captain Lindemann, and bears a percentage of the responsibility for the way that the Bismarck's mission went down. Lindemann, on the other hand, is another example of an officer who was actually pretty good. And although he's a captain at the time, probably could have risen to being an admiral had he survived. But he's lost with Bismarck, in part because of Lütjens. So,
a lot of destroyer officers who had been involved in Narvik have been transferred to Bismarck to help out with if they captured any ship or all sorts of things as crews for that, and they're lost as well. So they get another double whammy of losing those experienced destroyer crews.
The Kriegsmarine is perfectly capable of producing some very excellent officers. It's just that a mixture of politics and happenstance happens to knock an awful lot of their good ones off very quickly.
Yeah. By the way, since we've spent so much time talking about Bronte, he is in fact available in World of Warships in the armory for 1,500 doubloons. He doesn't have any special skills, but he is a unique historic commander. So if you want to, he's there. If you're interested.
Yeah, if unique special skills you are searching for him, the one he should have is he was an excellent destroyer artilleryman, and I think 1 year in the 1930s he had set the record or standard for the German Navy for longest range shot with a destroyer gun in an exercise.
Too late though.
That's the same thing. But it's a random one. While doing research on your book, you pick up these random facts about these people. I haven't checked that one out. It's just a story which stuck with me because it explains to me how much the Germans lose in Narvik.
Yeah, it's
It's
like,
not just the British. It's what they lose in terms of their culture, in terms of their institutional memory. It's just irreplaceable.
Yeah, I appreciate that. No, I just wanted to point this out because this was like our approach, because we wanted to. We've got lots of unique commanders with unique or improved skills, and we wanted to see if people are interested in just having like a historical figure like him that played a significant role. I think
You
let's
have
do.
a Captain Philip Vian who will take no notice of your orders, will take off the ship on his own and start randomly attacking the enemy wherever he finds them.
Not
not
yet,
yet.
but usually that's just me.
Sometimes also friends.
Maybe.
Yeah.
Let's do one more question, and I think then it's going to be time to slowly wrap it up. Unfortunately for tonight, let's have a look. Question from SMSGT or SM Sergeant. Narvik was considered a naval defeat for Germany. The Allied forces lost considerable men. Is it possible to consider the entire campaign a draw?
That's actually
Good
like a
question.
nice finishing question.
Yes.
So
Is it like the armless, legless knight hopping around the ground and saying, let's call it a draw? Or is it a draw?
It's from a naval perspective, it's a crushing defeat for the Kriegsmarine. From a land perspective, for the German military as a whole, it is a relatively resounding victory. They have problems. It takes a bit longer than they want it to, but ultimately they end that campaign in control of Norway, and the Allies are forced into an ignominious retreat. So if you want to look at it from a campaign perspective, a total campaign perspective, then yeah, you could probably call it an overall draw, because effectively each side has lost one theatre. Strategically in the near term, it's a German victory because they have secured their iron ore supplies. They have driven the Allies back. They have cost the Allies a fair number of ships. Obviously, they've cost them an aircraft carrier in the shape of Glorious, various destroyers and such like, damaged a few others, including a heavy cruiser that makes it back looking hilariously, literally almost like a powerboat because its stern is awash. But long-term strategically wise, it's probably edging more slightly towards a German defeat, because as the war goes on, whilst having the Swedish iron ore is useful, it becomes less and less useful, and the impact of those lost German warships becomes more and more apparent. But for the campaign, so yeah, I think if you're looking at it from complete 2020 hindsight, post World War II, it's probably roughly a draw in strategic terms.
One thing
I would differ on that one.
Go then.
I'd say it's a loss for the Allies. And I have this reason. Norway should not have been lost. Norway should have defended itself. They should have sent out a radio signal. They should have done it by radio, call up the reserves, and then I doubt the Germans would have got ashore. Honestly, the moment Denmark's invaded, that would have been the sensible decision to make, because even if they don't come, if you're activating your reserves after your neighbour's just been invaded, that doesn't seem like an aggressive act to me. But the moment you lose Norway, yes, you lose the iron ore to Germany, and that's annoying. Yes, they get the fish oil, which is lubricants and key for their explosives throughout the war. But more importantly, you lose the advantage that having Norway would have done. If you had Norway as even a neutral, but as an allied power in World War II, it would have had a huge effect on the Arctic convoys. It would have made them pretty much safe, other than from submarine attack. It would have had a huge effect on the Battle Atlantic, because you could have just had patrols going backwards and forwards with your planes from Coastal Command just flying across the North Sea constantly, from airbase to airbase, on the side, forcing German submarines to go the whole way through the North Sea underwater, which would have reduced their range. And if you was really been lucky, you could have possibly set up heavy bomber bases in Norway and used them to bomb the bejesus out of Germany. So I often say, I hate it when historians say the phrase, this, if they'd done this would have shortened the war by years. But honestly, if the Allies had won in Norway and had won the campaign, I honestly believe it would have taken years off World War II. Because you also have the knock-on effect on the Battle of France, because if the Germans have lost in Norway, even though it's a Hail Mary punch and they aren't sending that many troops there, they then have the psychology of having lost in Norway. And how has that affected the Blitzkrieg and the actions in northern France? And it also affects how the Allies approach fighting them in France. So I would say Norway is one of those campaigns where, yes, naval side, I would say it's an Allied victory. But the trouble is, because they lose ashore, it has a massive long-term implication. So overall, and this, as I said, does get me into trouble, but it's my opinion, it's a loss.
Yeah. To add to that, basically, winning in Norway meant that suddenly even stopping the submarines became harder, because they now can base off from Norway. It became even worse when the France fell, but still already Norway opened a lot of new approaches for the
and
submarine
let's be honest,
force in the
anything
Atlantic.
going to France has to go through the channel, so they're
Yeah.
going to have to go through minefields and all sorts of things. Norway, it's a straight shot.
Also gave them a great place to hide turbines for a very long time, which
Yeah,
was
and,
extremely annoying.
Yeah, and another thing also, it basically taking Norway meant that Sweden had to be extra careful in the future. So while Sweden did try to play both sides and to play a bit more to the Allied side as the war progressed and as it was becoming clear, they still were not in position where they can openly just say, screw you, we're out. While with Norway safe, they definitely wouldn't have at least so many incentives to keep Germany appeased as much as they did. I mean, they would still try to make money out of it, but they wouldn't have to be that careful.
It would also have massive effect on the whole campaign in Russia, because the Germans couldn't have sent troops up to Norway, trained them across Sweden, and sent them into the front that way. They would have lost that whole supply route. Norway is one of those campaigns where it has huge impacts, and then of course you have also the fact, well, then you have the fish oil, the iron ore going to the Allies, which would help their ship production. It would have put all sorts of things behind a protective curtain. It would have out of the range of German bombers, out of the range of German aircraft. It's one of those campaigns which has a massive impact on World War II and doesn't get discussed enough. It's kind of like the Italian Navy.
Okay.
Yeah.
And on that bombshell, I guess we're gonna slowly bring it to an end. I have a few administrative things to point out. First of all, Drachinifel has an excellent YouTube channel at youtube.com/Drachinifel. It's under his face.
Yes.
It's right there. You should go check it out. Somebody was asking earlier if you have an episode. He does these amazing videos about ships. It's like a specific ship. It goes very in depth about Warspite. And I believe, even without checking, you must have an episode. about
Yes, it's
Warspite.
actually one of the very earliest episodes. There's a 5-minute guide to Warspite, although at some point I will have to do a longer form Wednesday video about Warspite.
And until I can get him to write a book about Warspite, this is the Battleship Warspite by V.E. Tarrant. There is another book by Ian Ballantyne, but that tends to be more expensive. Both are very, very good. This one is lovely. If you are looking for more about Warspite, this is certainly a book to read. Has good maps and good pictures.
Okay.
Yep. Thanks for recommendation.
Then, of course, Dr. Alexander Clarke, I believe, has his book is finally published and out.
I'm not sure
Right?
if it's out published and out yet. It's supposed to be coming out this month, but okay.
So soon,
I've
you'll
got
be
pictures
able
for it. I have pictures of it though. I've got its front
You don't have a
cover.
copy?
I think I'll send you a picture of it.
You don't have one to hold up to the camera?
No, I did send you a picture of the front cover though, which I've been sent.
Yes. Tucky,
Yeah.
do the thing where you replace his face with this book.
Yeah.
Okay, I will do the thing.
He will do the
Please
thing.
do.
So we'll show you. So anyway, soon you'll be able to buy Dr. Clarke's book. It's about tribal destroyers. Destroyers, modern destroyers, tribals. There we go.
Battles and Darings, the genesis of the modern destroyer.
Darings, yes. Well,
Yes.
it's a genesis of the modern destroyer in the sense of World War II. So yes, it's.
It's when
Yes.
destroyers become general purpose instead of just being one thing.
Yes. So you can pick up this book on Google, and it'll provide you with an appropriate link.
And I have to say, this painting is beautiful.
Yeah.
Yes. I expect my signed copy in the mail at some point.
You will be getting. There are those 3 seagulls you see down in the bottom left corner of the book. They represent my 3 great uncles who died in the Fleet Air Arm in World War II. I mentioned it to the publisher and said, "Oh, that I lost 3 of them." And we always, whenever we see seagulls, we think of them. And he passed it on to the artist, who I don't know the name of, who included it very nicely. So this is with pen and sword, and I have to say they have been lovely. They're really lovely people.
That's a very nice tribute.
Yeah.
Yes. So I'm looking forward to
It's a gorgeous looking book. I'm not sure. The contents I hope are good, but I hope they live up to the cover. I've done my best to make them. I'm sure they do.
Yes. The real iDocument on Twitch is asking, is this the Russian stream? Da, comrade.
No.
Like, what do you think? Like, sometimes you guys
Shove it
ask
up.
questions where I really don't. You break me sometimes, chat.
Well, since we're asking silly questions, I will also mention one other somewhat silly thing, which is that, at least for those of you in the UK who can travel, if you want to come and say hello to me, and either, depending on how fortune goes, either watch me beating the living daylights out of somebody else in a bunch of medieval armor, or possibly having the living daylights beaten out of myself whilst in medieval armor, the Chalk Valley History Festival is coming up later this year, and I will be there on the closing weekend of the festival, doing my medieval reenactment. So if you want to come and talk about ships and confuse the living daylights out of everybody else as to why a medieval knight is talking about World War II battleships, please do come and say hello.
And completely randomly, as of today, I might be there as well for something else.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'm sure.
In which case, I expect to be given a sword and allowed to beat someone up.
That's what I was about to say.
You can take a revenge for your hammer.
I'm sure Drachinifel can lend you some armor.
Revenge. Oh.
Okay.
No, Drac has made up for that. He's bought me 4 or 5 to make up for the what he did to my hammer.
That's
So in the next episode, we see this hammer broken, right?
If he breaks the
possibly.
sledgehammer as well, then I'm going to send him for special tests. I think he's become Hulk.
Maybe a bit tricky. On other things that I would like you guys to be aware of, King of the Sea is of course going on. It started yesterday. Each day that it is playing, and this is going to be the 2 days of the next weekend, the 2 days of the following weekend, and then again very easily the 2 days of the weekend after that. All streamers that are participating and streaming King of the Sea have a special Twitch Drops campaign active where you can get King of the Sea collection containers, which give you collection elements, which let you complete the collection. And if you complete the collection, you get a random free tier 7 premium ship in a special container. So this is worth doing. So tune in to King of the Sea for the next few weekends. One more thing, if you are expecting our regularly scheduled program this Thursday, please don't be confused. We are not streaming this Thursday. There will be a Russian King of the Sea stream on Twitch this Thursday, and we are instead going to be streaming on Friday. So I will see you here on Friday. And with that, I'm done. Tucky?
Yes, I think it was a fun episode. It's
Yes.
we are slightly over time, but that's
That's
okay,
okay.
because it was running
means-
okay.
It means I tactically and strategically missed the time where I have to help put the children to bed. Don't anyone
By the
flip
way,
this.
just a question: where is the research assistant?
The fluffy research assistant is inside now. He was here earlier when we were doing the warm-up.
Yeah.
He's gone in for his tea.
Yes, say hello to him and tell him that he's a good boy.
Yes.
Will do.
Okay, and with that, I think we're gonna call it a night. Thank you so much for everyone tuning in. I hope you learned something today. If you want to, did you not want to shout out a book about the Narvik? If you,
Oh, yes, if you're interested in a book about Narvik, there is a very interesting one called Attack at Dawn, which I was holding earlier, which is by Ron Cope. And he's actually, it focuses on the H-class battle, Warburton Lee's engagement, but he's a son of one of the participants, and he basically did the research to try and find out what his father went through, and it's a really, really good book. I think that's the story of it, anyway. Yeah.
okay. So there you go. Some reading material for you, and we will of course catch you again next month with another episode of Armchair Admirals. I don't know if we've set the date yet, Tucky. Have we?
We have, but I have to open the calendar.
Okay. wo.ws/schedule is the place where you go to find out when we are going to be live.
It should be the 31st.
31st and of May.
Of May, yes.
And we are, of course, also going to have a Portal article about this. Okay, and then with that, I think without further ado, goodbye.
Yes.
Have a
Yeah.
beautiful week.
Take
And
care.
we'll see you soon. Yeah.
Indeed.
Thanks
See
very
you
much
soon.
for coming.
Thank you for
gentlemen.
having me.
Thanks for stopping by. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.